Hi everyone, my name's Griffin Bridgers. Today I'm going to get off topic from the more technical aspects of what I often discuss and continue the thread on this area that I plan to cover more intensely because I think it's going to dramatically affect not just the practice of various private wealth disciplines, but also how education, like the stuff I provide, is going to be tailored to audiences in the future. So we'll go through some examples of where we're at right now and some issues, and I want to highlight kind of the ethics undertone of this in terms of what is needed. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you this presentation is not intended to substitute for legal or tax advice. The opinions expressed herein are my own and not those of any of my clients, employers, or contractors. And I'd also like to emphasize that this is not an endorsement of any generative AI tool, despite the examples that might be used in this presentation. Now, before we get started, I want to note that what I'm about to read is not my original speech, but I do want to give you an example of what generative AI gave me in response to the prompt, write a script for Griffin Bridgers in his voice to discuss grantor trusts to an audience of attorneys, wealth advisors, and trust officers. So this is what we got. Now we have the stage direction instruction of Griffin Bridgers walks on a stage to a group of attorneys, wealth advisors, and trust officers. This is what I deliver. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I want to talk to you about an important concept in estate planning, grantor trusts. Grantor trusts are a powerful tool for minimizing taxes and protecting assets, and they're becoming increasingly popular in estate planning. As advisors, it's important that we understand how these trusts work and how they can benefit our clients. So, let's start with the basics. A grantor trust is a trust in which the grantor, or a creator of the trust, retains certain powers or interests in the trust that cause it to be treated as a grantor trust for tax purposes. What does this mean? Essentially, it means that the grantor is still considered the owner of the trust assets for tax purposes, even though the assets are technically held in trust. Why is this important? Well, there's a few key benefits to using a grantor trust. First, because the grantor is still considered the owner of the assets for tax purposes, the income generated by the trust is taxed at the grantor's individual tax rate rather than at the potentially higher trust tax rate. Second, because the grantor is still considered the owner of the assets, he or she can continue to control and manage the assets in trust. This can be especially beneficial for clients who want to maintain control over their assets, but also want to protect them from creditors or other potential risks. So how can we use grantor trusts in estate planning? There's a few different strategies that we can employ depending on the needs and goals of our clients. One common strategy might be to use a grantor retained annuity trust, or a GRAT. A GRAT allows the grantor to transfer assets into the trust while retaining the right to receive a fixed annuity payment each year for a certain term. At the end of the term, any remaining assets in the trust pass to the grantor's beneficiaries. This can be an effective way to transfer assets to the next generation while minimizing gift and estate taxes. Another strategy is to use a grantor trust to hold life insurance policies. By transferring a life insurance policy to a grantor trust, the policy proceeds can be excluded from the grantor's estate for estate tax purposes while still providing liquidity to pay estate taxes or provide for beneficiaries. Of course, there's many other strategies and variations that we can use with grantor trusts, depending on the unique circumstances of our clients. In conclusion, grantor trusts are a powerful tool in estate planning that can provide significant tax benefits and asset protection. As advisors, it's important we understand how these trusts work and how they can benefit our clients. Thank you for the attention, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Now, again, that's end of speech. That's what ChatGPT wrote me. That is not my original work, what you've just heard. So moving on from this, Before we get into what ChatGPT got wrong, because if you were listening to that, there were a number of things, some of which I'll address and some of which I won't even necessarily write out that might have flown under the radar, but this is an example of the type of content we can expect in the future from generative AI, especially when we look at the education front. How do we educate and market services to both peers and clients? And the worst case is that generative AI is really plagiarism without the ability to check it. It draws from sources and condenses them to a very well thought out, very well written, polished type of speech like I just gave. Now, I want to note that not everybody in this space is an attorney, but attorneys do have a variety of ethical duties to their clients and to the practice in general. And a number of those duties could be breached by the misrepresentation of ChatGPT as your own work if you're an attorney using that. Now, again, I want to mention that, this has been so far the talking point at the top of the bell curve for a lot of the AI fans is that this could streamline the aspect of your work that involves education, marketing, so on and so forth, content creation. But when you pass it off as your own work, that is an issue. Now, I want to note this isn't a new issue. There's a lot of attorneys out there who have blogs and articles on their website. And if you've ever done this, I have. It's kind of fun. Take an average article you might see, especially that sounds generic, and Google one line of it. And sometimes you can find that an article or blog post that might be on an attorney's website has been repeated verbatim on several other attorneys' websites, which usually indicates that the article itself has come from a content mill. So I think there's an ethical issue in that in and of itself, but as a segue, I'll mention perhaps it's the paid content mills that are in trouble. Why pay for that type of generic content when you can have ChatGPT produce it for you? But I digress to the core ethical issue of even passing off as your own content, whether it's used for continuing education, branding, marketing, whatever the case might be, especially in a situation where professionals like attorneys and other advisors in the private wealth community have problems with public trust to begin with. Does the use of generative AI undermine that trust further? So I think it's more important than ever with generative AI to come up with a plan as to how you're going to be able to prove in any situation that your work is genuine. And it's hard to do that, especially in a world of deep fakes where we now have AI that can actually mimic people's voices, tone, cadence, and potentially reproduce that. But big picture, and this may rankle some people and ruffle some feathers, but my hot take, my opinion, is that if you produce something like this and you cannot personally explain the topic better than the article you post, whether it's from a content mill or generative AI or even from any sort of marketing or client management system, then frankly, you have no business passing off that content as your own. So that's my soapbox, but expect to see much more on this in the future, especially the ethical issues around this. Now, let's go to what ChatGPT got wrong in the speech I just delivered. Obviously, I would say never take it verbatim. You need to make it your own somehow and fact check it. So are you truly saving time? Perhaps we'll look at that, but by no means is this an all-inclusive list, but I want to highlight some things at the top of the bell curve. One, the speech it generated repeatedly said that the grantor is treated as the owner for quote-unquote tax purposes, but that's an incomplete statement. Grantor trust rules only apply to income tax. When you say tax purposes, this implies all tax purposes, which could be the outcome if certain legislative proposals come down the pike. But for now, really the benefits of a grantor trust hinge on the fact that the trust is actually respected as the owner of assets for gift, estate, and GST tax purposes. But that could be blown if you follow the advice of the article, which said that a grantor can maintain control over the trust assets. Well, that may not be true if you want to obtain those gift, estate, and GST tax benefits that are really at the core of using the grantor trust strategy. Another issue is that the article assumes and implies that the grantor is always the deemed owner of all trust assets. That might not be the case. The grantor might only be a deemed owner of some assets, or even just the accounting income from those assets. And likewise, there could be multiple grantors, which create partial grantor trusts with respect to each grantor, which muddies the waters further. So, in the grand scheme of things, you can't assume that every grantor trust is a wholly grantor trust. And I would see this becoming a huge audit issue in the future. Third, this speech that was output ignores the fact that a beneficiary could also be a deemed owner of a trust or a portion thereof, as long as a grantor is not a deemed owner of that same trust or portion. That's the central premise behind a number of the more modern estate planning tools. The speech recognized that this is a growing trend and an increasingly popular benefit, but I'd argue that really the increasingly popular benefit isn't necessarily the question of whether the grantor is the deemed owner, which is a concept that is decades old at this point. More the benefit that is at the top of the bell curve or at the end of the bell curve in terms of innovation is this question of whether a beneficiary can be the deemed owner. And that's the central premise behind some popular strategies like a BDIT or a BDOT. Fourth, the speech itself put forth as the shining examples of grantor trusts, a GRAT and an ILET. But the benefits of those aren't necessarily unique to the grantor trust status. Those are hardly the best uses of grantor trusts if you're truly trying to leverage this deemed income tax ownership. So arguably, a better example might have been if you have a sale of an asset to an intentionally defective grantor trust, perhaps in exchange for a promissory note, either by the grantor if the grantor is the deemed owner, or perhaps by a beneficiary if the beneficiary is the deemed owner. There's a lot of assets we could use, or examples we could use in that vein. We could even dive deeper into Q-tips and slats, where you could even have a spouse as a deemed owner to sell assets to that trust that is settled by the non-selling spouse, again with a similar structure to a BDIT or a BDOT, but with some differences. But there's a number of ways we can leverage grantor trusts in modern estate planning that don't really hinge on, as primary examples, things like GRATs and ILETs. So, what's the outcome here? What's the end game? What is this going to lead to? Well, there's a number of blind spots that we're not going to necessarily see. But I'd see one thing being possibly that these issues create an increase in live presentations, especially in person, because you can't fake it. You can't put a robot of yourself on stage and get it to speak on continuing education topics or in a seminar on estate planning or wealth management or whatever to be delivered to clients. But while there are clearly technical errors in the ChatGPT script, I have to give credit where credit is due. It's helpful as I read through from a structure and copywriting perspective, which is perhaps where I could see this having the best utility in taking my personal speaking to the next level and showing more of that structure that could be adopted as your own. But regardless of that, if an attorney is reading a ChatGPT script on a video, again, you can't really know if it's their genuine work product, even if they're the one speaking in front of the camera. And as I mentioned, there's been some recent deep fake types of things that mimic audio or video of a live person, which could raise the question again, if an attorney isn't actually in person, do we know it's actually the attorney delivering that information? So the big question for clients is, do you want to work with somebody who would basically leverage themselves by creating artificial fakes of their voice and content and putting it up in a way that misrepresents their actual expertise and ability to relate to you as a client? Especially because there's a number of people out there who dread client interaction and don't have the soft skills or feel like they have a gap in soft skills. And that could lead to situations where perhaps there's artificial client explanations. We've already talked about how the technical documents from generative AI may not be up to snuff, but given the structure I saw here, could this lend a voice and a cadence that you might not personally have to fill that soft skills gap. Now, I've yet to talk about this, but there are some utility benefits within ChatGPT to create a client type of interaction that sounds less robotic and more personable and warm. And I think that's going to be another area that can be faked in the future, possibly at the expense of the client. So, what's next in this vein? I'm going to continue to cover AI issues just because I think it's going to be a huge growing area, especially in wealth management, wealth transfer, and even in ethics for attorneys and other professionals in wealth management. So, some of my curiosities coming down the pike might be, for example, the use of generative AI to write your website, both from a copy perspective and on the back end, not just the HTML, but perhaps some of the deeper programming, Java and other things in your website back end. I'm also curious about the use of generative AI to write the code needed to automate your practice. There's a number of software solutions out there that provide no-code automation, which still require a bit of a learning curve. So how much could ChatGPT save you some time in filling that gap and perhaps allowing you to avoid purchasing software or, as I mentioned earlier, a content mill subscription, and then using this as a way to automate your own practice, but still maintain your genuine voice in the documents that are created. Now, if you're a tax or estate planning practitioner and you have questions or topic suggestions, you can email those to me at griffin.britters@gmail.com with the caveat that I cannot give tax or legal advice in response to your questions. And you can email me at that address as well if you need a speaker for your upcoming estate planning council, bar association, CLE, conference, whatever the case might be. What I can guarantee you is that you'll get my genuine voice and not a ChatGPT script like I just read. So reach out if you're interested. But I thank you for listening to this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my future content.